Sometimes when you're on a roll, it's hard to imagine it can ever end. We've all been there. A winning streak at poker, effortlessly troubleshooting problems at work, every trade you make going green, each move you make is flawless, like someone from above is smiling down at you. But then, out of nowhere, that momentum suddenly shifts. Now everything you touch turns to dust, nothing goes right, every hand is 2s and 7s, each issue at work is a baffling mystery, trading is tantamount to burning cash. You're convinced you're cursed. The Vought company knew this feeling all too well. The years that followed the end of hostilities in 1945 were not kind. Despite having produced the hugely successful and stunningly beautiful F4U, things just seemed to go downhill after the Corsair. Even though they'd been leaders in naval aviation for the past 20 years, they were having a really hard time transitioning and adapting from piston engines to jet propulsion. Despite having tried to replicate the success of their famous gull-winged bird, none of the F4U's immediate successors even began to live up to the Corsair's reputation. Their three port-war designs were, respectively, a flop, a failure, and a letdown. But just when the company was on its last legs, a call came in from the Navy. They needed a fast, advanced, carrier-based fighter. Basically, everything Vought had failed to deliver in their previous trio of creations. Vought knew they had to win the competition. It was make or break time. No more failures. So they kissed the dice, and with one last roll, they started work on their fourth and possibly last jet fighter design. 21 months later, what rolled out of the Vought factory was unlike anything before. What they created wasn't just their last fighter, it was the last of the gunfighters, and during the Vietnam War, it would earn the title of the MiG Master. In this multi-part series, we'll go over the story of the iconic Crusader from soup to nuts. I understand she's an aircraft that's been covered by other creators, but I wanted to cover what can be considered the very complex evolution of the Crusader in my way. As always, make a cup of Earl Grey, open a fresh packet of snickerdoodles, and let's get cracking, shall we? Chance Milton Vought, born on the 26th of February 1888, became interested in aviation at a very early age. By the time 1912 came around, he'd already participated in the design of several aircraft. He was taking flying lessons at Cicero Field near Chicago, Illinois, gaining his pilot's license, FAI number 156. Interestingly, in his class were other gentlemen who would also go on to make their mark in aviation, such as Glenn Martin, T.J. Ellison, Eugene Ely, and Starling Burgess. In November 1913, with Mexico-US tensions rising, Vought and the Aero Club of America urged Congress to purchase aircraft for any potential conflict. Navy Secretary Josephus Daniels backed the effort, promising to round up pilots if aviation units were needed. In 1914, the Europeans were again engaged in their time-honored pursuit of cutting each other's throats. As the war intensified, he saw an opportunity to increase homegrown naval aviation programs, writing the famous phrase, "Eyes of the Fleet," in an editorial pushing for more funding. The term stuck, later proving prophetic for his company. By 1915, the Curtiss Airplane and Motor Company had hired Vought as their seaplane engineer. He helped design massive flying boats, dubbed Americas, and labeled H-2 to H-12. That year, he joined the Wright Company, rising to Chief Aeronautical Engineering Executive after its 1916 merger with Martin. At the ripe old age of 28, he launched the Lewis and Vought Company in June 1917 with Birdseye B. Lewis, a former aerial scout for Pancho Villa during the 1916 border war. Lewis soon left for the mercenary ventures, dying in France with General Pershing's American Expeditionary Forces. Despite losing his partner, Vought pressed on alone, delivering the Navy's first production aircraft in 1917, the 150 horsepower Hispano-Suiza engined VE-7, built as a fighter, trainer, and observation plane. In October 1922, a modified VE-7 became the first aircraft to take off from the USS Langley, an American aircraft carrier. Designs like the F4U Corsair biplane followed. Vaught's first Corsair, distinct from the later F4U, the official first Corsair and A7 Corsair II, which ought to have been the Corsair III. By 1922, he renamed the company the Vought Corporation, appointing himself as president and chief engineer, but passed away prematurely in 1930, only 40 years old. The company's last biplane, the SBU, was followed by its first monoplane, the woeful SB-2U Vindicator carrier-based dive bomber, making its first flight in 1936, of which the US Navy purchased 169, with the French Navy getting their hands on 40. The Vindicator saw service in the Pacific in 1942 in the Battle of Midway with the US Marines, flying with VMSB-241, where the Japanese made short work of the dive bomber. However, thanks once more to the Europeans going at one another, the most successful naval-borne fighter of the war was born. Initially, the F4U, designed by Rex Beazle and Russ Clark, was rejected for American carrier operations. It spent the first 3 years of its combat life flying almost exclusively from island bases. For a time, it looked like she would only see carrier service with the British, flying with clipped wings just so she could fit on their smaller ships. In time, the F4U found a home with the US Navy and Marine Corps squadrons on American carriers, fighting her way across the Pacific. The F4U Corsair continued to fight well after World War II, seeing action in Korea, with production ending in 1953, with around 12,000 across all variants rolling off the line, and becoming one of the best fighters of the war. Without a doubt, the F4U set a high bar. With the advent of the jet engine, the manufacturers had to throw out the rulebook and start from scratch, many poring over the mountains of loot they had liberated from the Germans as part of Operation Lusty. They hoped the blueprints and German jet aircraft would give them the head start over their competitors. Not that any of this helped Vought, since before the end of the war, they'd already begun work on the propeller-powered XF5U. This strange, disc-shaped, twin-engined contraption morphed into the XF5U-1 that only started taxiing trials in 1947 for it to be canned by the US Navy in 1948 because they saw the future was with jets. This was strike one for Vought. However, Vought wasn't totally blind to the advantages of the jet engine. They had been working on another interesting aircraft, one that was born from a Navy contract. The very conservative, straight-winged, unambitious-looking X-56U was completed in 1946 and christened as the Pirate, in keeping with the firm's nautical lineage. Constructed with metalite, a Vought patented material of high-strength alloy bonded to a balsa wood core, meant that the Pirate had a strong, lightweight structure, tipping the scales at 7,320 pounds, which was just as well since she was powered by a single 3,000-pound thrust Westinghouse J34WE22 turbojet, less than half the empty weight of the aircraft, making it painfully underpowered. The lack of power led the third prototype to be the first US jet to be fitted with the J34WE30 afterburning engine, which raised the total thrust to 4,100 pounds, enabling the aircraft to reach speeds in excess of 540 miles an hour, only 100 miles an hour or so faster than late-model Corsairs. Much can be written about the Pirate, maybe one day, but after just 30 being produced, the Navy cancelled their order and was to remain a development aircraft. Nothing more. Strike 2. If the Pirate was boring and conventional, their next creation was anything but. Born out of a Navy requirement for a high-performance shipboard jet fighter issued in 1945, the tailless, twin-engined F7U Cutlass was, despite looking like a very advanced machine, with its swept-back wings and powered with a pair of Westinghouse J34WE22 afterburning units, it would be the first aircraft armed solely with missiles, and the first to release ordnance in excess of Mach 1. However, not all was rosy. During testing, a Navy commander met a Marine lieutenant colonel who had just landed an XF7U-1. "What do you think?" asked the commander. "Is it any good?" Nope. Well, does it have any potential? Nope. All 3 Cutlass prototypes were lost in crashes. Despite the 2 afterburning engines, the Cutlass was considered woefully underpowered with a relatively low climb rate of 13,000 feet per minute, leading it to acquire one of its many unflattering but well-deserved labels, the Gutless. Even after being fitted with a pair of Westinghouse J46 engines, each producing 5,800 pounds of thrust and afterburner. However, some documents state that they were produced much less than that, meaning losing one engine meant the aircraft and pilot were doomed. Interestingly, Westinghouse also manufactured household appliances at the time, whereby several pilots disparagingly claimed that their engines put out less heat than Westinghouse's toasters. Despite their uprated engines, even these couldn't remedy the situation with one highly experienced Navy flyer, a combat fighter and test pilot who characterized the F-7U as a gutless, thirsty dog with low performance and miserable range. Not to over-egg this pudding, but by the time the Cutlass was withdrawn from naval service after only a few years, it had an uncommonly high accident rate, earning itself the very unflattering and alarming sobriquet of the Ensign Eliminator, with about a quarter of all late-model Cutlasses lost in various accidents, one pilot calling it an unforgiving, unreliable airplane that took too many lives before it was retired. Vought definitely earned this 3rd strike. So why am I telling you all this? Well, simply put, because after such a bad run of luck and dismal aircraft, what they produced next made Vaught's achievement even more impressive. In September 1952, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics issued a request for proposal with specifications for a new fighter capable of both point and area defense of the fleet that would have folding wings, be easy to maintain, include machine guns and or cannons, as well as missiles, coupled with high maneuverability, and above all, be able to go supersonic in level flight. At the time, the Air Force's impressive Century series, like the F-100, F-101, F-102, and F-104, were capable of supersonic flight, almost as an everyday occurrence. In contrast, naval aircraft rarely exceeded the performance of their land-based contemporaries due to seaborne aircraft being heavier, in part due to their sturdier landing gear and fuselage strengthening that added additional weight. Regardless, the Navy wanted a carrier-based day fighter, capable of Mach 1.2 at 30,000 feet and Mach 0.9 at sea level, a 25,000 foot per minute climb rate, but with only a 100-knot landing speed. Vought was one of 8 manufacturers that included McDonnell, North American, Douglas, Convair, Lockheed, Grumman, and Republic in the running to win the contract. Of these, only Douglas, Grumman, and Vought had actual experience with carrier aircraft. Convair and Republic had absolutely none. In all, some 20 different fighter designs emerged, some examples being a modified F3H Demon from McDonnell, a pre-Phantom. North American offered its FJ5 Super Fury, a navalized F100 Super Sabre, and Grumman proposed its Super Tiger, an improved F11F Tiger. Although Vought was one of the 3 with naval aviation experience, this requirement came only 2 years before the Cutlass entered service. It was still a new aircraft, and it was experiencing considerable difficulty. Based on its run of poor designs, it's rumored that the company's future was made clear to them by Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, overseeing naval aviation development, Rear Admiral Apollo Susek, who told them that if the next design wasn't a winner, Vought could kiss the Navy goodbye. Although there's no direct historical evidence that Rear Admiral Apollo Susek specifically warned the Vought company about the consequences, it was a very real consideration. With the company's future on their shoulders, the Vought team, led by John Russell Russ Clark, including Whit McCormack, Connie Lau, William Schulfield, and Fred Dickerman, went to work on their 4th fighter design, the V-383. Over the next 5 months, they went through numerous designs and redesigns that were sketched, scrapped, tweaked, considered, rejected, and modified. Finally, all the engineering and test data were put to practical use when in May 1953, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics impressed with what they saw, told Vought that they had won the competition and were awarded a letter contract. The following month, they received the formal agreement to build 3 flyable experimental aircraft, a full-scale engineering mock-up, a static test specimen, and wind tunnel test models, with the Defense Department giving the project the designation XF8U1. In addition to the fighter proposal, the Navy was also interested in a photo reconnaissance aircraft version, the V392, that would later develop as the F8UIP or RF8A. Most had expected another wild Vought creation, but with their fate hanging by a thread, they went down a more conventional path. Well, sort of. Remember, this was Vought. Although they discarded the tailless designs and the pancake fuselages, they did include some interesting gambles. Let me explain. Among the F7U's many problems, its lousy visibility and sluggish low-speed handling topped the list, alongside brutal stalls and a jittery center of gravity. Due to its swept wing design, which enhanced high-speed performance and tailless layout, it had to maintain a 20-degree angle of attack during takeoff, necessitating an unusually gangly and heavy nose gear. However, such a steep angle of attack was far from ideal for carrier landings, where stability and visibility were crucial, making many pilots sweat every approach. Vaught's solution was inspired. From the start of the design process, Clark and the team had the idea to hinge the high wing at the rear spar, so that it could be raised 7 degrees on takeoff and approach. The wing would be tilted up by a hydraulic piston with a pneumatic backup in case the primary system failed. This kept the wing at the desired high angle of attack, while the fuselage and cockpit were effectively lowered, giving the pilot a good forward field of view. This 2-position variable incidence wing was to become the hallmark of the future F8U. At the first sight of the F8U with a raised wing, how many of us thought the machine looked broken? An added advantage of this setup was that there was no need for the lanky and ultimately weaker assemblies of the F7U or even the A4D Skyhawk nose gear. Another advantage of the raised wing was that it added to aerodynamic braking. However, it didn't need much help, considering that it had a huge belly speed brake that swung down directly below the fuselage, which was to become the bane of any inattentive Crusader pilot if they forgot to raise it prior to landing, something that many pilots managed to do, irrespective of experience, earning a chat without coffee with the CO and the scorn of the maintenance crews. To further reduce the takeoff and approach speeds, the entire leading edge of the wings and the ailerons were interconnected in such a way that they could be simultaneously lowered by 25 degrees when the pilot engaged the wing positioning handle in the cockpit. This increased the wing's effective curvature, or camber, providing more lift at low speed. These droop ailerons, which were kept inboard of the wing fold line so that the control linkages would remain less complex, were known as flaperons. There were also 2 small landing flaps made of magnesium and positioned immediately next to the fuselage, but when retracted, merged with the aluminium droop ailerons. Once the aircraft was airborne, the wing was lowered, and all the control surfaces were returned to the normal in-flight position. The wings had a moderate 42-degree sweep and a 5% anhedral droop to improve lateral stability. A dog-tooth notch at the wing fold extended slightly in front of the inner portions. This small discontinuity improved yaw stability at high speeds by generating a vortex to stabilize airflow. The end of the wing could be hydraulically folded in the upright position for storage, and there were no control surfaces except for the drooped leading edge. Interestingly, a few enterprising pilots attempted to take off with the wing still folded, with a few succeeding. In 1960, a pilot flying an F8U-1 was the first to take off with wings still folded and fly around for around 24 minutes before landing, and he wouldn't be the last. When it came to the power plant, Vought wouldn't go timid. At the time, they were still part of United Aircraft Corporation, where Pratt & Whitney was the largest division. This gave Vought an inside track on Pratt & Whitney's model JT3, the prototype of what would become the J57. Clark and his team recognized the J57's potential, as its thrust-to-weight ratio and fuel consumption met their design requirements. Initially, the US Navy wanted Vought to install the flight-rated Air Force J-57P-11 engine instead of the unrated J-57P-12 as initially planned. This was an interim measure until the 12 variant was fully flight-rated. Vought ultimately went with the Pratt & Whitney J-57P-11, the first jet engine rated at 10,000 pounds of dry thrust and nearly 13,000 pounds with afterburner. However, I must point out that some documents state the J-57P-4A was fitted. Let me know in the comments. This engine was from the same family of power plants powering the Super Sabre F100, but where the F100 weighed in at 21,000 pounds empty, the F8U-1 was just 16,500. The Vought team wanted to make the most of the power of the J-57 to ensure that their creation was going to be fast. Although the Crusader was built primarily of aluminium alloy, the engineers also embraced the advancements in metallurgy by building 25% of the fuselage from an exceptionally lightweight, heat-resistant magnesium alloy. Then there was titanium, which was, at the time, God's gift to aviation. 40% lighter than steel, strong, able to resist temperatures up to 1660 Celsius, and virtually rust-proof. A real game changer for naval aircraft where salt water would make short work of a lesser metal. This wonder metal, which had only just started to be produced on a commercial scale since the late 40s, was used for part of the center section and the tail assembly, which could be pulled off for easier engine access. Speaking of the tailplane was an all-moving affair that pivoted as a single piece, with a Stinger-type arrestor hook retracted flush into the fuselage under the tail section. Vought engineers also paid close attention to the shape of the airframe, elongating and thinning the aft fuselage to accommodate the extended afterburner, and applying the newly discovered area rule that gave the body the pinched or Coke bottle waist, which minimized supersonic drag. But she was no delicate flower. While the wing was immensely complex and functional, it was also enormously strong. The airframe was rated at 6.4 Gs positive and 3.0 Gs negative, according to the official figures in the pilot's manual. Although these figures were definitely on the conservative side, military requirements dictated that an airframe be tested to 1.5 times the design limit. This meant that the Crusader could withstand up to plus 9.6 and minus 4.5. However, one flying admiral recalled, the F8U-1 had a nice springy gait because it flexed so harmoniously, saying that it would take close to 8 Gs to bend a Crusader permanently, if not disintegrate it completely. The Crusader was fitted with numerous unique bits of kit, including the RAT or ram air turbine, installed on a hinged panel on the right side of the forward fuselage. The RAT provided emergency hydraulic and electrical power. It has been said that it saved many aircraft during the F8's long career. When I first saw the F8, it was strange to see such a large aircraft sitting so low to the ground. Measuring 54 feet 3 inches in length and with a wingspan of 35 feet 8 inches, but just 15 feet 9 inches, gave her a squat but elegant appearance with a surprisingly short, stout main gear and nose wheel assembly to withstand those brutal controlled crashes on the carrier decks. I read that the F8 had a tendency to be landed on its nose wheel, which may be why the Navy went to a solid hub nose wheel. Being low to the ground also had the added benefit of making it easier for maintenance crews, but the ground crews had to be wary of the jet intake, which was so low that the aircraft earned the nickname Gator and could inhale an unsuspecting victim whole. In February 1955, 21 months after the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had placed their order, the first XF8U-1, Buno 138899, dubbed the 1X, was ready. Due to the runway at Vaught's Hensley Field, Dallas headquarters not being lengthened, the Navy decided that 1X would be tested at the Air Force Flight Test Center, Edwards Air Force Base, California. The following month, partially disassembled, Vought loaded the fuselage aboard an Air Force C-124 transport at Dallas and took it to Edwards, the wings arriving by road a few days later, on the 16th of March. The first flight was scheduled for the 25th, and until then, the team assembled the machine and carried out taxi tests. Ross Clark, his engineers and chief test pilot John W. Conrad, was so confident in their aircraft that they planned something special for the first flight: to break Mach 1 on their maiden outing. Supersonic flight wasn't new in March of 1955, but it was in straight and level flight, especially by a conventional aircraft. Maybe this was to emulate the F-100 Super Sabre, which had also gone supersonic on her maiden flight. On the morning of the flight, Conrad completed his pre-flight checks, fired up the J-57 engine, pushed open the throttle, and roared down the Rogers Dry Lake runway at 182 knots. The nose wheel lifted gently into the air, followed by an Air Force F-100 and a TF-86F chase planes. Once at 16,000 feet, Conrad cut the afterburner, trimmed her out, and performed some additional in-flight checks. Satisfied, he relit the blower and climbed to 35,000 feet. Once there, he carried out some high-speed handling characteristics and maneuverability tests. Happy with the aircraft, he engaged the Go Baby Go switch, pushing the F8U1 up to Mach 1.05, making this the first time a Navy fighter had gone faster than sound in level flight. 52 minutes later, Conrad was back on the ground, reporting that acceleration through the sound barrier was smooth, pleasant, and rapid. Over the following 5 years of testing, the prototype made 508 flights, using 17 different J-57 engines. A few weeks later, Conrad, who was to make the first flight in all Crusader models over the next 6 years, except for the F8U2 and the French version, was back with the second XF8U1, number 138900, or 2X, which by this time had been given the name Crusader, in keeping with the company's predisposition for piratical names. The testing continued in earnest throughout 1955, festooned with cameras and telemetry equipment providing data for the engineers to pore over. During the test flights, the pilots discovered that at altitude, the Crusader tended to crab or yaw. This was fixed by adding a pair of ventral fins seen on all future F8s, further adding to her shark-like appearance. Vought could carry drop tanks, but they would rarely fly with them given that the initial versions had a massive 5,000-liter fuel tank, giving the pilots at least 3 hours of endurance. Flight testing will always be fraught with dangers, especially during the early days of high-performance fighters. In February 1956, Vought test pilot Harry Brackett was performing high-speed tests out of Edwards Air Force Base in the first production F8U1 when during one pass, an aileron hinge failed due to excessive G-force broke away, causing the aircraft to disintegrate in a matter of seconds. Brackett, who had survived ejecting from an F7U a few years earlier, was unable to escape from the F8U. Initially, Vought fitted the Crusader with their in-house ejection seat, but by the time the F8U2 came about, standardization required equipment like the seat to fall under GFE, or government-furnished equipment. This meant installing the British-made Martin Baker seats. However, 00 ejection seats didn't arrive until the mid-1960s, and until then, out-of-envelope ejections were not advised, quite unnerving for Navy pilots, where a failed catapult shot would take them into the water unless they were quick enough to punch out before riding the aircraft into the sea, which could be a matter of only a couple of seconds. Only 1 in 5 pilots who entered the water survived. John Conrad also had bad luck on the 14th of August when his engine suffered a compressor stall during a high-altitude flight near NAS Dallas. After repeated attempts to restart his failed engine, he was forced to take to the silk and parachute to safety. By the time the Crusaders retired, their pilots had to resort to hanging up the for sale sign over 500 times. The first a year before the type ended service in 1956, and the last in 1997 while in French service. While the aircraft was still in the testing phase, Vought had already begun production of the first FBU-1. In 1957, they secured a $200 million contract to produce additional Dash 1s, totaling 318 units. Of these, 50 were delivered without an in-flight refueling probe. The remaining fighters had a retractable lance housed under an electrical blister aft the cockpit. Crusaders and Photo Crusaders became fully operational with the 6th Fleet on the 1st of February 1957, with the 7th Fleet on the 15th of February. creating a supersonic navy. On the 25th of March 1957, exactly 2 years after the first flight of 1X, the first Navy fighter squadron FV-32 Swordsman became fully operational with the Crusader 1 fighters. Russ Clark and his team had pulled Vought from the brink with the F8. Early on, it was clear that Vought had a HotRod winner with the Crusader from the first flight, after John Conrad had taken the prototype past Mach 1. Naturally, it didn't take long for the Navy to want to show it off, setting its sights on eclipsing the Air Force's speed records and finally getting one over them. Commander R.W. Duke Windsor, a seasoned test pilot with more hours in the F8U than anyone in the Navy, was tapped to push the Crusader beyond the elusive 1,000 miles per hour in level flight and become the first production aircraft to do so. However, political machinations saw to it that the F8 would have to wait before they could take a crack at the record, as the Air Force was getting their Super Sabre ready for a similar attempt. On the 20th of August 1955, an F-100C flown by Colonel Horace A. Haynes raised the stakes when he clocked an official 822 miles an hour. By the following year, the British had upped the ante further, and after 8 attempts, they claimed the world's level flight speed record with the experimental Fairy Delta II at 1,132 miles per hour. Undeterred, the Navy pressed forward with its plan, scheduling Windsor's run for August 1956. Accordingly dubbed Project 1 Grand, the attempt was to be made over the expansive Mojave Desert in California. Windsor, who had already unofficially nudged the aircraft to 1,100 miles per hour during testing, approached the challenge with a fair amount of confidence. Interestingly, Navy brass instructed Windsor to hold back from revealing the F8U's full potential. The reason was tactical, not technical. Although the F8 was capable of exceeding the British record, they didn't see the need to disclose the fighter's capability to the world, or more accurately, to potential enemies, directing him to exceed 1,000 miles per hour and leave it at that rather than max out the aircraft's capabilities. FAI rules required 2 passes over the course, and the final speed would be an average of the 2 runs. Fuel was key for the half-hour flight, mostly an afterburner, and to ensure Windsor had enough fuel, Vought chilled the JP-5 with dry ice to pack as much as possible into the tanks. Windsor knew the Sierra Nevada route from 8 practice runs. On August 21, 1956, a clear day, he took off at 6:50 a.m. in F8U-1 Buno 141345, the 12th production model. Loaded with dummy weight equaling a full load of ammunition and 16 Mighty Mouse rockets, he climbed to 40,000 feet, going supersonic at 32,000 feet on the way up. Precision mattered more than raw speed. It wasn't a case of slamming open the throttle. The rules were strict. During the run, Windsor couldn't drop more than 328 feet or climb past 1,640 feet from his start altitude. 32 minutes later, he landed. His 2 runs averaged 1,015.428 miles per hour. It convincingly beat the Air Force by 193 miles per hour, but fell 117 short of the British record. That was fine. The Navy just wanted the 1,000 mark. While this fell short of the British record, it handily outpaced the Air Forces, and was enough to earn the Navy and Vought the prestigious Thompson Trophy. But Vought wasn't done yet. The following summer, the Crusader's photo reconnaissance variant, the F8U-1P, took center stage in another headline-grabbing exploit. Marine Major John H. Glenn, backed by the Navy's Air Test Center in Paxarkent River, Maryland, devised Project Bullet, a supersonic coast-to-coast sprint from west to east. Beyond breaking speed records, Glenn aimed to photograph the entire United States during the flight. On July 16, 1957, Glenn piloted F8U-1P Buno 144608, the 3rd production reconnaissance model, with Navy Lieutenant Commander Charles Demler escorting in a standard F8U-1 fighter. The pair departed Los Angeles at 6 a.m., supported by a robust Navy team. Squadrons VAH-6 and VAH-11 provided AJ-1 Savage tankers for mid-air refueling, while VFP-61 meticulously prepared the cameras aboard Glenn's aircraft. Trouble struck early when Demler's refueling probe was damaged during the first refueling stop, forcing him to abort. Glenn forged ahead solo. 3 hours and 23 minutes later, he touched down at Floyd Bennett Field in New York, averaging 725.55 miles per hour, or Mach 1.1. When going all out, and between several in-flight pit stops at about 250 miles per hour, Glenn was hitting around Mach 1.7. After landing, Glenn said, "My old girl was really performing perfectly. She was going like a scolded duck, and this is a standard plane with the fleet and not a souped-up job. You'll excuse me for being a little prejudiced for feeling we having the best fighter plane in the world." Glenn later received a Distinguished Flying Cross for his effort. No doubt, this record flight cemented Glenn's reputation. He would later become the first American to orbit Earth in February 1962 and serve as a U.S. Senator of his home state of Ohio. Glenn's trusty F8U-1P soldiered on and was eventually upgraded to an RF-8G configuration. Its storied career ended tragically in December 1972 when it crashed into the flight deck of the carrier USS Oriskany off Vietnam. The young pilot ejected, but the aircraft, forever tied to Glenn's Project Bullet, now lies at the bottom of the South China Sea. The Crusader's string of triumphs culminated in the Collier Trophy, awarding to Vought and the Navy for pioneering the first carrier-based fighter capable of exceeding 1,000 miles per hour. We'll pick back up on the Photo Crusader later on. Between the 20th of September 1955 and the 5th of September 1958, Vought rolled out 318 production F8U-1s, later redesignated as F8As, to eliminate inter-service confusion and high-digit designations. The F8U-1 was initially powered by a single Pratt & Whitney J57 P12 turbojet engine, which, after the delivery of the first few dozen aircraft, was replaced by the J57 P4A that provided up to 16,500 pounds static sea-level thrust with afterburning for a top speed in excess of Mach 1.5 at 35,000 feet, fitted with the AN/APG-30 ranging radar for daytime and good weather missions only. Initial carrier qualification tests that took place above the USS Forrestal with the F8U Buno 140446 in April 1956. Patuxent test pilot Commander R.W. Duke Windsor performed the initial tests with the first catapult launch on April 4th. Many pilots who flew the Crusader referred to her as a hot rod and a thrill to fly, although the cockpit visibility was not the best. According to some, the seat needed to be raised to get a good lookout. Still, it was better than most jets of its day despite a big blind spot behind, while something like the MiG-17's low seat and thick canopy glass limited its pilot's view, and the MiG-21's 40-degree blind cone made it the weakest for spotting threats. However, flying the F-8 is one thing. It was said the most stressful part of the flight, more so than combat, was during the night carrier landings, where a pilot's heart rate would be higher than when in a dogfight. The decks of the 27 Charlie carriers, like the Ticonderogas, were smaller than most in the fleet, and flying an aircraft with no heads-up display and instruments that would be considered antiquated by today's standards required nerves of steel and a head on a swivel, scanning the approach, the instruments, meatball, lineup, and angle of attack. Keeping the F-8 flying on the approach was made more difficult as the Charlie carriers would tend to move around a lot, adding to the stress, which, if they landed with too much euphemism, could collapse the landing gear on impact after steep approaches. The armament consisted of 4 Mk-12 Colt Browning 20mm cannons with 84 and later 144 rounds per gun, 2.75-inch Mighty Mouse folding fin rockets, and 2 AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air heat-seeking missiles, which they chalked up 14 kills against MiG-17s and 4 MiG-21s during the Vietnam War, although some sources claim 19 total kills, for the loss of 3 F-8s, all to MiG-17s. This was the highest kill ratio of 6 to 1, and with probable claims factored in, a 7-to-1 success rate was achieved in the first 3 years of the Vietnam War, more than any other fighter in the war. Even though other types had more kills, mainly due to numbers, earning herself the title of the last gunfighter, which you'll see mentioned by pretty much every publication in every video without fail, including this one. There is even an adage that goes like this: if you are out of F8s, you are out of fighters. But her fame as the last gunfighter may have been slightly overplayed. I mean, there's no doubt that it's a very cool moniker, but when you consider that all but one of the F8's victories were with AIM-9D missiles, it isn't easy to justify the grand title. So, how effective were the 4 Colt Mark 12 20mm cannons? From the 1950s until the mid-1960s, it was thought that guided air-to-air missiles would render guns obsolete, but it was quickly discovered that missiles had certain limitations. Therefore, guns were still on the wish list. Even the Air Force strapped a 20mm gun pod designed for air-to-ground use as an air-to-air weapon for its gunless F4s. From the start, the F8U-1's 4 guns, located right below the cockpit, 2 on each side, proved troublesome. Apart from giving too wide a dispersion of bullets, some fleet squadrons even reported problems that the excessive vibrations from the guns sometimes caused instruments to shake loose in the cockpit, apparently. However, the biggest issue with the Mark 12 cannons was their tendency to jam during high G maneuvers, frequently jamming the ammo belts in their chutes, preventing proper feed to the breeches. One study concluded that while they were effective when available, their 20mm cannons were generally unreliable. Not a great situation when going up against the MiGs, where they reportedly either jammed or failed to fire completely on half the engagements. Despite the cannons being able to fire a respectable 660 rounds per minute, providing roughly 13 seconds of sustained fire if they were armed with 144 rounds per gun, they seemed to work reliably only when no G-forces were applied to the airframe. For example, they were great if fired against a hapless MiG unaware of a Crusader coming up behind it or strafing targets on the ground. Otherwise, they were likely to jam, leading to another claim: if your guns don't work, you are in an F8. Naturally, pilots were not happy with the guns on them, so a modification was made whereby the gun circuitry was rewired to allow the pilots to select via a cockpit switch which pair of guns he wanted to fire, thus conserving his ammunition, something essential for strafing when Crusaders were required to support combat air patrol for downed flyers, helping to keep hostile troops away or to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Despite these problems, at least 2 MiGs were said to have been claimed by the F8 cannon, but only one MiG-17 could be officially confirmed, which was downed at very close range under low G flight conditions. In reality, the 2 AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles carried on fuselage cheek rails, 1 per rail, were the F8U-1's primary weapons, and its guns were secondary. The Sidewinders performed well, provided they were fired within their parameters, which they weren't about 60% of the time. Not only were the guns unreliable, but the missiles, despite being good, also suffered from serviceability issues, which, after months of multiple catapult shots, arrested landings, high G flights, and constant mounting and dismounting from the aircraft, tended to deteriorate. Besides the guns and missiles, the first Crusaders carried an unusual package of 16 or 32 Mighty Mouse 2.75-inch folding fin rockets in a belly pack, which swung down directly below the fuselage, which was supposed to provide the pilot with a measure of ground attack capability. But this idea was dropped in the F8U-2 series. No fighter jock mourned its passing. These rockets had been a bane in the lives of many pilots, as the rockets proved to be not only ineffective due to inaccuracy, but also dangerous to the pilot and aircraft. The rockets were aligned in series to fit into the launcher magazine, one directly behind the next. It was a choice that streamlined the design but carried significant hazards, since a rocket that failed to launch risked being hit by the one following it, possibly detonating. A misfire could also jam the launcher, preventing it from retracting and consequently obstructing the nose gear door, which made extending the nose landing gear impossible. Even when the rockets fired as intended, their precision was poor, with one analysis indicating that to secure a 97% likelihood of striking an enemy bomber, 128 rockets, equivalent to a full load of at least 4 Crusaders, had to be unleashed in sequence, and given the accident rate of the Crusaders, ramming the bomber would have been more effective than the rockets, although to be fair, they were as useful as an area suppression weapon. The F8U-1E, later known as the F8B, was an improved variant of the F8U-1. The first flew in September 1958 with 130 units built. It retained the F8U-1's armament, including the ventral rocket pack, though most squadrons operated with it sealed. The AN-APS-67 radar was added to provide limited all-weather and air intercept capability, an improvement over the basic ranging radar in the F8U-1 for its guns. 187 F8C types followed the F8U-1E. These were considered the first true fleet aircraft and the first of the Crusader II models, later refurbished as the F8K or simply Charlie. First flown in August 1957, with a wingspan shortened by 6 inches and fitted with Martin Baker ejection seats which replaced the Vought developed units previously used by the F8A, RF8A, and F8B models. Powered by a new Pratt & Whitney J57 P16, which pushed out 10,700 pounds of thrust dry and 16,900 in afterburner. The performance of the F8U-2 with a new engine was impressive, having a climb rate at sea level of more than 25,000 feet per minute, more than enough to propel the aircraft almost to 1,100 miles per hour, or Mach 1.7 at 35,000 feet. This extra power needed 2 air scoops mounted on the upper part of the tail cone just after the vertical tail for increasing cooling to dissipate the heat generated by the afterburner. It also improved the AN-AWG-3 armament control system with the AN-AP767 radar set and fire control that could lock onto a target at 16 miles, but with limited all-weather capability. They were distinguished from the A and B models by their pair of fixed low-aspect ventral fins for improved directional stability. They prevented unwanted side slips and potential spins at high altitudes, and would be standard on all future F8s, even though many pilots said they hardly noticed any difference. The Charlie also acquired a new Y-rack to carry 2 additional sidewinders to address the issue of going to war with just 2 missiles, whereas the F4 had 4 of them to count on. Although considering the flaws with the early sidewinders, it probably didn't make much difference. However, these extra missiles were only occasionally carried, as pilots were not keen on the added weight penalty that made the aircraft nose-heavy and draggy. It also made it harder for the Crusader to reach minimum landing weight if the weapons were not expended. One major flaw in the Charlies was that the engines had a 2-second afterburner delay if they didn't have the new and improved nozzle modifications fitted to some of the previous versions. This lag almost cost the life of Lieutenant Tommy Irwins. During a carrier landing on the Hancock, Irwin's F8 Crusader successfully snagged the carrier's number 4 wire. He was about to retard the throttle when he suddenly realized he wasn't stopping. The F8C arrestor hook point had sheared from the shank. His only chance was to lift off again. Therefore, he selected the afterburner. By now, the indicated airspeed was below the 80 knots needed for a successful ejection, and the 2-second delay between selection and burner light would seal his fate. Nevertheless, he pulled the canopy jettison handle, but there wasn't enough airspeed to lift the canopy away, and had no choice but to roll off the deck and ride the Crusader into the water. As the F8 hit the sea, the afterburner ignited, causing the engine to explode, the splash carrying away the canopy. Fortunately, Irwin escaped and was picked up by a rescue helicopter, but the aircraft sank to the bottom of the South China Sea. During the life of the Crusader, pilots had to eject 493 times, and of the 1,261 built, 517 had been lost. 84 F8 were lost in Vietnam due to AAA, SAMs, and small arms, plus 3 to MiGs, a loss rate of 41%. The F8U-2 Charlies were further developed into the F8U-2N, also known as the F8D, for the Navy and Marines to carry out night missions. These were externally the same as the Charlie, but had the AN-AWG-4 armament control system that included the AN-APQ-83 radar set, coupled with the AN-AAS-15 infrared scanner set above the new nose radome and homegrown Vought 3-axis autopilot. These avionics was supposed to be an improved fire control radar, designed to enhance targeting and all-weather combat capabilities, although many pilots thought that the new system was garbage. Although the radar was considered next to useless, most fighters of the era relied on a surface radar station or an airborne radar platform to find the enemy at a longer range and guide the fighter to a point where it could lock onto the enemy and then take over the intercept. These deltas had the J-57 P-20 power plants that delivered 18,000 pounds of thrust in afterburner, able to hit a maximum speed of 1,228 miles per hour or Mach 1.86, and were to be the fastest of the Crusaders. This additional thrust was enough to compensate for the improved radar and avionics while retaining the 4-cannon armament and the 4-sidewinder capability. They also deleted the belly rocket tray with an 87-gallon fuel cell. Although the Delta saw some action in Vietnam with 2 Navy squadrons, VF-111 and VF-154, it was quickly surpassed by the F8U-2NE, or Echo, powered by the J-57 P-20 engine, and was considered the definitive jack-of-all-trades, bruiser of a Crusader, and the one that would claim the most MiG kills in Vietnam. The Echo, first flown at the end of June 1961, diverted the Crusader from a pure air superiority and fleet defense fighter. Since a carrier group can only carry a certain number of aircraft, having a one-trick pony day fighter was seen as a poor use of deck space. Wouldn't it be better to have a general-purpose fighter with a strike capability? Therefore, this model was fitted with 2 wing pylons to carry Zuni rocket packs and the AGM-12 Bullpup radio-guided air-to-surface missiles, which had the control and guidance equipment mounted on the upper surface of the wing center section and enclosed in a humpback fairing. The Echo was also the first fighter capable of hauling a Mark 84 2,000-pound bomb. To help the pilot deliver their ordnance, the Echo was fitted with the AN-APQ-94 search radar that was supposed to detect MiG-sized aircraft as far out as 30 miles and larger targets as far out as 60. With its larger 21-inch diameter dish, this new radar changed the nose profile, giving it a larger radome, making it longer than any previous F8 noses, increasing the aircraft's overall length by 3 inches. When Vought proposed its model V392 photographic reconnaissance version of the Crusader to the Navy, the response was swift. The Navy placed an initial order for 1 prototype and 19 production aircraft. The prototype was to be adapted from a modified F8U-1, earning the designation Photo Crusader. The Vought Crusader F8U-1P development began with the 32nd production aircraft, BUNO-141363. Of the first 735 Crusaders produced, 144 were converted into these specialized high-speed reconnaissance aircraft. To make it work, it was powered by a J-57P-4A engine, going supersonic during its first outing on the 17th of December 1956. Vought removed the 420mm cannons and fire controls from the forward fuselage after eliminating the guns. The engineers reduced the size of the horizontal tail to increase her speed, now the aircraft's only defense. The sides and bottoms of the fuselage were squared off to provide flat surfaces for the electrically heated optical windows needed for the cameras. These flat surfaces were then fed into existing contours around the air duct inlet, the nose cone, and the canopy enclosure, and into the fuselage midsection at the forward end of the main landing gear wells. The engineers worked the area rule principle into this updated layout, shaping a slight hump on the fuselage's upper surface just behind the canopy and stretching it over the front part of the wing. This tweak smoothed out the fuselage contours, letting the in-flight refueling probe tuck fully inside and sit beneath a flush door, ditching the blister cover found on the fighter version. The initial setup featured 3 trimetragon cameras in Station 2, the aft bay. These provided horizon-to-horizon coverage using a Ka-66, producing a 3-inch strip of 70mm film. Later, the Ka-68 replaced it, widening the strip to 5 inches for better detail. Stations 3 and 4 held 2 cameras, Ka-51, 53 or 62 models, offering vertical and oblique views at 5, 15 or 30 degrees. Focal lengths range from 6 to 12 inches. Station 1, under the nose, mounted a Ka-45 or 51 for forward oblique shots along the flight path. It could also take a 16mm movie camera, although that was rarely used. Taking good photos required skill. Pilots had to rely on a simple brush ring on a pantograph arm to frame the view. The forward camera in Station 1 captured ingress routes for bombers, which was key during Vietnam. The panoramic camera in Station 2 evolved from a basic locator to a valuable sensor with the Ka-68 upgrade. The F8U-1P first flew on December 17, 1956, marking 54 years since the Wright brothers' flight. Production ran through 1958 and 59, ending in early 1960. The F8A, as was the new designation, joined the fleet with VFP-61, a squadron tracing back to World War II. Originally VC-61, it flew recon missions in Korea with jets like the F9 F2P Panther and prop planes like the F4U 5P Corsair. Renamed VFP in July 1956, it got its first Crusaders in September 1957. Detachment Alpha deployed on USS Midway later that year. The RF-8 differed from its fighter cousins. Its stabulator was smaller, prioritizing speed over agility. Design loads were plus 6.4 and minus 2.4 Gs, sufficient for photo missions. The flat belly affected aerodynamics, sometimes causing float during landings and stretching the glide angle slightly. Early night missions used photo flash bombs instead of infrared tech. In 1962, VFP-62's commander R.A. Koch tested a dual plane method. One RF-8 flew at 2,000 feet, dropping 110 million candle power flares. Another at 3,000 feet, shot forward at a 15-degree angle. Most missions teamed an RF-8 with a fighter escort, cruising at 4,000 feet to stay above small arms fire while slipping under the reach of heavy anti-aircraft artillery. Surface-to-air missiles posed a real threat, though the Crusader's speed offered some edge, even if pilots carried nothing more than a .38 police special revolver for protection. They tackled thick air defenses every day for 8 years in Vietnam, and as long as the jets stayed airborne, they returned with the photos. By October 1965, Vought remanufactured 73 RF-8As into the RF-8G model. This new model had J57 P-22 engines, ventral strakes for stability at high altitudes, Doppler radar, infrared scanners, and underwing hardpoints for various external stores, such as ECM pods and auxiliary fuel tanks. These photobirds would ultimately be the longest-lived US version of the Crusader, only retiring in 1982. But before then, VFP-62, with their photo Crusaders, were in the thick of it when the world was on the brink of a nuclear war. The RF-8A Crusader got its first operational test in late October 1962, when the Navy and Marine Corps deployed it during the Cuban Missile Crisis after agents on the island had tipped off the US earlier that month about possible missile bases, prompting the need for confirmation. Following the intelligence reports, U-2 flights were sent to take pictures but returned with grainy photographs, which showed some hints of Earth moving for potential construction sites for Soviet missiles. But the grainy images weren't enough for President John F. Kennedy to act decisively. He needed clearer shots, fast, to address the threat and avoid nuclear Armageddon. So on October 13th, VFP-62 and Marine Squadron VMCJ-2 were placed on standby at Cecil Field near Jacksonville, ready to act while the Air Force's RF-101 Voodoos, despite their touted low-level capability, sat grounded with faulty camera systems until October 29th. The RF-8A stepped in to fill the gap, flying low and fast over Cuba to gather the detailed imagery that the high-altitude U-2s, limited to 1 or 2 frames a minute, couldn't match, especially since the Crusaders, at 600 knots and 5,000 feet, could capture several frames a second for sharper, broader coverage. 4 Marine pilots joined VFP-62 to bolster the effort, flying Navy RF-8s under the codename Operation Blue Moon, which launched on October 23rd, with 6 aircraft targeting 3 sites in pairs, peaking on October 27th with a high of 14 flights in a single day, a cycle that yielded over 160,000 negatives across 6 weeks of intense operations. On October 23rd, Commander William Ecker and Lieutenant Bruce Willemley launched from Key West, dropping to 1,000 feet over western Cuba's mountains with 5 cameras rolling to capture where Soviet troops were suspected of building a facility for medium-range missiles aimed directly at the United States. Upon returning to Jacksonville, their film was rushed to Andrews Air Force Base and then delivered by CIA couriers to a covert lab located in an upper floor of a Ford dealership in a derelict block at 5th and K Streets in northwest Washington. There, analysts worked through the night on 3,000 feet of film, and by 10 a.m. on October 24th, CIA official Art Lundahl presented President Kennedy with clear images proving Soviet leader Khrushchev had broken his promise not to deploy offensive weapons in Cuba, a revelation that fueled the U.S. naval blockade and over 100 Blue Moon missions by Navy and Air Force pilots. Those photos, showing the missiles weren't yet operational, gave Kennedy critical time to negotiate as the crisis pushed the world closer to a nuclear conflict than ever before. Each completed mission left its mark on the RF-8s, with some aircraft bearing a dead chicken symbol painted below the cockpit, a jab at Fidel Castro's quirky 1960 demand in New York for a freshly killed chicken to avoid poisoning, alongside the phrase, "Smile, you're on candid camera, near the camera blister," adding a touch of dark humor to the high-stakes work. Meanwhile, at Guantanamo, VMCJ-2's Marine RF-8s had been gathering electronic intel for 2 years, using F-3D Skynights that flew pre-dawn missions from Caribbean bases like Jamaica to provoke Cuban radar responses, which they recorded and relayed to the Joint Chiefs. As the crisis hit, a 2-plane RF-8 detachment relocated from Puerto Rico to Gitmo, escorted by VMF-122 F-8s, after F-104s failed to link up, with Captain Harold Austin overseeing logistics for 42 men and gear moved by C-130. Those Blue Moon photos were vital, delivering real-time intelligence to Kennedy when messages between Washington and Moscow lagged by hours, though only a handful have been made public in the 50 years since leaving most locked away. Researcher Michael Dobbs, while working on his 2008 book 1 Minute to Midnight, uncovered stacks of intel reports but no raw film until Dino Brucioni, a retired photo interpreter, directed him to the National Archives' refrigerated storage room, nicknamed the Ice Cube facility in Kansas, where thousands of cans from the crisis had laid undisturbed for years. Unable to visit, Dobbs ordered 10 cans at a time to Maryland, navigating a classified CIA guide and random numbering until a stray document revealed one can's ID to locate the Blue Moon stash, where he reviewed 200 cans holding thousands of images. The footage captured the pilot's challenges, navigating with maps, compasses, landmarks, and considerable luck over treetops at 550 miles per hour, operating cameras while scanning for construction sites, military vehicles, or other suspicious activity, and once spotted, having to hold steady and level for a second or two as they took the shots, all while facing constant risks of mechanical failure or enemy fire. Some reels clearly showing the RF-8 flying low and fast over the Cuban landscapes, interrupted by military sites and missile installations, and then suddenly coming under anti-aircraft fire. The photos also highlighted intelligence missteps, such as a bunker near Managua labeled "No Change" on October 27th, surrounded with a single fence with vines growing over it, which Soviet records later confirmed held Frog missile warheads, not just conventional weapons as the CIA assumed. Most critically, the CIA couldn't pinpoint the 36 medium-range warheads, each 70 times more powerful than Hiroshima's bomb, despite Kennedy's repeated questions, guessing they were near Mariel, when Dobbs, using film and Soviet interviews, traced them to Bayuco, 20 miles away, where 6 overlooked vans moved them from Sagua La Grande starting October 26th. Bayuco's single fence misled analysts expecting fighter security. It seems like the Soviets went with security via obscurity, and had Kennedy known the truth, he might have ordered a strike, potentially a win or a disaster igniting Soviet-American clashes, though he opted for caution with incomplete data. Still, the photos guided day-to-day key decisions. On the 26th, they identified a nuclear-capable Frog missile launcher taken by Navy pilot Gerald Covey just the day before, and these photos provided the president with the information he required. So long as they were not operational, he had time to negotiate. However, this all changed when on October 27th, now remembered as Black Saturday, the most dangerous day of the entire Cuban Missile Crisis, when everything seemed to be falling apart. Around noon that day, a U-2 on a reconnaissance flight piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson Jr. was shot down over the island by a Soviet SA-2 surface-to-air missile, when Soviet commander Stepan Grechko in Cuba gave the order to fire, despite Moscow not having authorized it. This attack lit a fire under a US colonel, a non-aviator who ordered Captain Harold Austin to photograph the missile site responsible for the downing of the spy plane from 35,000 feet, right in missile range. Despite Austin's insistence for a safer, more effective low-level run, he was told by the colonel that there would be a few fighters offshore. However, what good would they do except watch Austin be shot down? Nevertheless, he flew the mission, albeit reluctantly, under the watch of an offshore fighters powerless against a missile strike. At the same time, as Anderson's U-2 was shot down over Cuba, another U-2 pilot, Charles Maltzby, accidentally flew into Soviet airspace over Siberia due to a navigation error, causing Soviet MiG fighters to be scrambled to intercept him. While these events unfolded, the US Navy destroyer USS Beale started dropping signaling depth charges on the diesel-powered Foxtrot-class submarine B-59, one of 4 Soviet subs operating near Cuba as part of their fleet deployment. These charges were, in hindsight, a clumsy attempt to force a submarine to come to the surface for identification. The B-59, carrying a nuclear-tipped torpedo and cut off from Moscow due to communication issues, faced a tense issue when its captain, Valentin Savitsky, and the political officer thought war might have broken out and were under attack, ordered the torpedo prepared for launch. However, Vasily Arkhipov, the flotilla's chief of staff aboard as second-in-command, overruled the order, requiring unanimous consent among the officers and ultimately stopping a nuclear strike that would have escalated the crisis. To top it all off, analysts reported that 5 of 6 sites were fully operational, and time was running out. That night, Robert Kennedy met the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Drobin with a warning of imminent action, offering he would publicly agree not to invade Cuba if the Soviets pulled their missiles out and the United States would withdraw their medium-range missiles from Turkey, a deal Khrushchev accepted to end the standoff. For 3 weeks after, F8 monitored the Soviet pullout, flying until mid-November when Kennedy confirmed Khrushchev's compliance. Although the regular flights paused on November 15th, they continued sporadically until June 5, 1963. For their efforts, the 12 Navy pilots and 4 Marines received Distinguished Flying Crosses, while VFP-62 earned a rare peacetime Navy unit commendation from Kennedy on November 26, 1962. In the 1960s, the French Navy was in the market for aircraft for their new carriers, the Foch and Clemenceau, generally comparable to the US 27C class aircraft carriers, and rather than building one themselves, they instead turned to the Americans. After seeing the 2-seater TF-8A trainer at the 1962 Paris Air Show, they were suitably impressed that although the F4 was already in service, it would have been too large for the smaller French ships, and after initial trials aboard the Clemenceau by 2 F8s from American carrier Saratoga, the Crusader was chosen. The major issues with the Crusaders were its high approach speed, and given the smaller French decks, Vought had to find a solution if they wanted the order, and the answer was the addition of boundary layer control. This meant Vought had to rework the F8's wing extensively. The idea behind boundary layer control was to improve lift during takeoff and landing by directing engine bleed air over the upper surfaces of the flaps and ailerons, allowing the aircraft to operate at lower speeds and enhancing carrier performance. Additionally, the wing incidence was lowered by 2 degrees, and the tail was slightly enlarged. These modifications collectively reduced the aircraft's approach speed by 17 miles per hour, improving landing precision and safety. The BLC configuration on an F8D was used as the test airframe and flew for the first time. However, that aircraft crashed in April of that year. The French Crusader was designated F8E FN, where the FN stood for French Navy, of which 42 were ordered. The first FN flew on June 26, 1964, and was assigned to complete the test program. The 4 20mm cannons and the ability to carry 4 fuselage-mounted Sidewinder missiles were retained, along with provisions made to carry the French-built Matra R530 air-to-air missile, one on each side of the fuselage on rail launches. On October 5, 1964, the initial wave of French Crusaders touched down at Saint-Nazaire. Flotille 12F became the pioneering aeronaval squadron to adopt the Crusader, with Flotille 14F joining the ranks 6 months afterwards. In 1978, Flotille 14F transitioned to the Super-Étendard, and by 1991 it had disbanded, leaving Flotille 12F as the sole aeronaval interceptor unit still operating the Crusader. Despite its outsider origins, the Crusader won the hearts of many French aviators. Seeing an opportunity to improve on the Crusader, Vought produced the Juliet models, which were 138 remanufactured Echoes and were the first US Crusaders to get the BLC and the more advanced APQ-124 radio set with its increased detection range. However, these new radars seemed to work well when they first arrived at the fleet, but after a time it was soon discovered that these pieces of 1960 technology, full of vacuum tubes, moving parts and hydraulic fluid, failed thanks to the toll of frequent hard landings, the shakings, the sudden G-loadings, salt water, and the heat. Thus, many fitted radar systems remained unrepaired, and when they did work, they were only used to join up with other aircraft in a strike package or locate a tanker aircraft. By then, the Juliets were in the thick of the fighting over Vietnam during the closing 18 months of the war, and fighter pilots did not stick their heads into radar scopes while over hostile territory. Ever. The threat from MiG, SAMs, and AAA fire was always present. Although the Js had BLC, larger horizontal control surfaces, armor plating, the ALQ-100 and APR-30 for ECM, the new radar, and modifications to the airframes that extended its life to 4,000 hours, these came at the cost of weight, adding 2,000 pounds of extra mass they had to haul. In addition, the BLC drew 1,000 pounds of thrust from the engines, an absolute liability during a carrier landing if carrying 2 AIM-9Ds in ammunition if the air temperature was greater than 85 degrees. A solution to this was to land with minimum fuel. Despite being fitted with the most powerful J57 turbojet used by the Crusaders, the J57 P20A engine that put out 18,700 pounds of thrust in afterburner, giving the Juliet a max speed of 1,086 miles per hour, or Mach 1.65 at 35,000 feet. Some pilots even warned that the F8J was flat out dangerous and were against operating the Juliets in hot, humid weather, not to mention that it was also slightly less maneuverable in combat. Interestingly, a 2-seat trainer version wasn't developed until 1962, when, up until that point, all pilot instruction was completed without the luxury of a purpose-built trainer. Many pilots claimed that the Twosader, as it became known, arrived too late, and many pilots were lost due to inadequate training. Most Crusader pilots made their first flights, first carrier launches, and more nerve-wracking, their first carrier landing, alone. Vought took the 74th production F8A into a one-of-a-kind dual-control tandem-seat aircraft designated F8U-1T, later the TF8A, powered by the J57P20 engine, derated to produce the same thrust as the J57P4A engine, about 16,200 pounds in afterburner, but still capable of Mach 1.6. To make room for the aft compartment, which sat 15 inches higher than the forward cockpit, the 20mm cannons and their ammunition boxes and belt feeds were removed. The trainer was also the only F8 to carry a power brake in the tail cone. It performed so well that the Navy ordered 12 Twosaders. However, their purse strings were tightened, forcing the cancellation of that order before any could be built. For a short time, the Royal Navy initially showed interest in a variant of the TF8A and would have powered their Twosaders with their own Rolls-Royce Spays, offering 2,000 pounds more thrust than the J57P20, but ultimately opted for the more expensive F4 Phantom II aircraft instead. They also offered the Crusader to Lebanon, but again, it wasn't purchased. After the Navy was done with the single Twosader, it was passed on to NASA, where it was redesignated NTF-8A and served as a chase plane amongst other duties. When Vought got a contract in 1977 to provide refurbished F8H2 to the Philippines, the trainer was regained from NASA to provide transition training for the Philippine Air Force pilots. However, the T's long career ended on the 28th of July 1978, when Vought pilot Ken Fox and Philippine Lieutenant Pascualato Ramos had engine trouble and had to eject. Ejecting from their aircraft near Dallas, the TF-8A crashed in a farmer's field, ending its 16-year career. I hope you enjoyed the first part of this F8 story. In the following episodes of the Crusader, we will cover her service during the Vietnam War and how she fared in combat against the MiG, and a deep dive into how the Sader compared to the fabulous F4 Phantom. Don't forget to leave a like, and please consider subscribing so you don't miss the next F8 episode.